Good afternoon, Michael. Thanks so much for joining us from New York while you're out on tour.
Sorry, I'm not there. But yes,
We
good to
are
see you.
too. Well, let's dive into my first question. It's fascinating to know how you're able to find and tell the stories about the few who see things coming while the rest don't. How do you find these stories and people? What piques your interest?
You know, it's always for me. It always starts with a question. And sometimes it's like a really simple question. I think back to like Moneyball. When you realize that you've got one team that's got $40 million to spend on players and another team that's got $200 million to spend on players, but the team with the $40 million is winning more games than the $200 million is a natural like question. Like how? And that simple question, when the question gets you places, it gets more and more interesting. That's what keeps me going. And I'd argue that I think probably with every book I've written, I could identify the question that got it going in the first place. And once you kind of grab onto the interesting question and start pulling, it's like the thread on a sweater and it starts to unravel. So that's what gets me to the people. And that I end up with people is not that surprising, because you start with a question that seems like might be an interesting question. Inevitably, you find some person who's been asking that question themselves in a different way. And when you find someone who has been asking it sort of with a certain obsession, you got a character. Like all the best characters are obsessives. They're all the best characters go too far, and the very best characters go too far, and they don't realize they're going too far. That they don't think of themselves as characters. They just naturally going too far because they've got themselves absorbed with this particular question.
That's great. You have also famously said there are no points for hesitation. And you've said that waiting for more data can actually be harmful. And this brings to mind the phrase, perfect is the enemy of good. How do you know if something is good enough?
That's a funny question to put to me, because I'm myself am of two minds about this. There is there's a really strong argument, especially in certain spheres of human life, uh, to be really wary of intuition. Like there's almost nothing that people won't think that they have some meaningful intuition about. Like I promise you that if we like took everybody in that room and gave them um, uh, um, a coin to flip and said everybody's going to flip a coin and try to flip heads. And after one flip, half of them are gone. After two flips, another half of them are gone, until we get down to a handful of people. And there'll be people who think they have an intuition for knowing their coin, how their coin's going to go. That people will take a random process and think that they know something about it. The stock market is the best example of this. Like you can't predict like the movement of stock prices. You just can't. But there's the whole industry is premised on the idea that you can, and it's in some ways a dwindling industry, but nevertheless, those. So there are places where you've got to be very careful about intuition, but I do think there are places where there are patterns that can be detected, that are actually patterns, where intuition can play a role. And can I give you? I'll give you an example, and the example is, I mean, this most recent book I've written, The Premonition. And it's not exactly about people who saw it coming. It's not as simple as that. They didn't see it coming. They knew that they thought of it as a pandemic as a more serious risk than most everybody else did. And they prepared themselves for it. And then, but they didn't see it coming exactly, but they were alive to the possibility. And they were all people who had spent their careers one way or another managing communicable diseases. Um, and so it's kind of incredible to me, actually, that you have a handful of people, these people, who last January have actually put their finger on what's going on in China before like the Centers for Disease, weeks, actually months before the Centers for Disease Control does. And they do it. They do it partly because they're looking for it, but they do it because they have the understanding that in some cases, now this may not be true of like evaluating baseball players, but when you're evaluating a pathogen or in the beginning of a pandemic, if you wait until you have the data to write a scientific peer-reviewed paper about what's going on, the war is over, right? If you wait until you have deaths, you're looking at a process that's growing exponentially that ends in death, a month after someone has contracted the virus. So by the time you start to kind of be able to count the bodies, you're overrun by the virus. So these people, not only kind of were they in an environment where there were patterns they could detect, but they were in an environment where they knew they had to exercise their intuition because there was no substitute. By the time they got good enough data to say for sure that, I don't know, the death rate the fatality rate is 0.5% and the reproductive rate is 3, all the things you need to know to kind of craft precise public policy, by that time it would be too late. So it's sort of a combination of things. Are you in an environment where there's genuine patterns to be recognized, where your hunches may actually be meaningful? But the second thing is, are you in a situation where you need to do that? If you're a general manager of a baseball team, you don't really need to do that. You can wait to get the data you need to evaluate the player. But if you're at the beginning of a pandemic, you don't really have much choice. So I would say, be very wary of intuition, because you're going to think you know things you don't. But there are times and places where it pays off.
And that's really interesting as you think of your most recent book, and you were talking about the thread at the beginning and pulling of that thread. What was the thread for you in this particular story?
So there are two things. And one of them is, the theme of your conference is like groundbreakers, right? And it was actually stumbling upon the oddest kind of groundbreakers. And I think that's a good way to describe a lot of the characters in my books, right? At the beginning of the pandemic, I had two questions. The first was, how was it that we as a society were performing so badly? Like that we as a society who, judged by experts to be the best prepared for a pandemic before one happened, of all countries in the world, how did we have 5% or less than 5% of the world's population and more than 20% of the deaths? I didn't understand how that had happened. So I started to kick around and asking, like, what was the plan, and why, if there was a plan, and why has it not worked out so well? And it turned out there were these groundbreaking characters who had created a plan for this country that we basically didn't use, but that other countries used. And I'm gonna briefly describe these characters because they're so unexpected. And the story dates back to 2006, 5 or 6, when President George Bush, who's been traumatized at least twice in his presidency, first by 9/11 and second by Hurricane Katrina. And he's sitting there thinking, all these things that seem like remote risks, maybe they aren't so remote after all. And some really cruel person hands him a copy of John Barry's History of the 1918 Pandemic, I call it the Great Influenza. Bush reads this book on vacation and goes, oh my God, 50 million people died worldwide, like from the flu. And he comes back to work and he says, I want to know what the plan is for this thing if it happens. Comes the answer from inside the White House, we don't have one. So Bush flips and gets very angry, manages to get Congress to authorize $7 billion to create and implement a plan. And then they go about trying to figure out what you do. And what they did, it's actually a very encouraging story about the United States government, that rather than kind of go about it in a bureaucratic and slow way, from the White House, they said, let's find the 7 agencies in the government. The agents happen to be 7. The agencies in the government that are going to be involved in any kind of pandemic response. They called up the leaders of the agencies and they said, send us the most original thinker you have in your whole place. In this group of people, it ended up being 7 people, were 2 doctors, and these are the groundbreakers, Richard Hatchett and Carter Mecher. One from the Department of Veterans Affairs and one's from Human Health and Human Services. But what they really were was just doctors. Like one was a cancer doctor and one was a critical care doctor who had a gift for saving lives in critical situations. And they weren't really like government people. They were just doctors. And they're tasked with, they were given a piece of the problem that we all live with. And it was, what do you do between the time that the bad thing starts infecting people, and they were thinking flu, but it could be anything, and the time you have some pharmaceutical response, some vaccine. So what do you do to save lives? Because presumably it's going to take a lot of months to like get a vaccine and get it into people. So what do you do to preserve lives? And the conventional wisdom, and here's what was the amazing thing, and I think it's kind of like an undertold story. The conventional wisdom 20 years ago was that there was nothing you could do. And the conventional wisdom was that because people took this lesson out of 1918, that they saw that like in America, every city did something in response to this pandemic flu. And they shut down churches and closed schools and social, what we call social distancing. They did this. And there was kind of death everywhere. And people didn't make any kind of distinctions between what happened in one place and what happened in another. So these 2 doctors, they pick up this history of the 1918 flu, and they notice that people are dying everywhere, but the rates of death are clearly pretty different. And then they go on this like 9-month jag, again, from their jobs in the White House. No one's really asking them to do this, where they go and rewrite the history of 1918. They go into the newspaper archives. They go to figure out what happened in San Francisco, what happened in St. Louis, and what happened in Philadelphia. And they find that the cities that timed their interventions earlier in relation to the arrival of the virus in the city had experienced much lower death totals. So like St. Louis had a fraction of the deaths of Philadelphia because St. Louis had implemented these interventions earlier, before the virus got going and started multiplying exponentially. And that it hadn't been fully appreciated at the time. Not good enough data, nobody's really making the distinctions. They then proceed to write with the help of a genuine academic named Mark Lipschitz, who's an epidemiologist at Harvard, like the history of what happened in these cities. And they essentially completely turn on its head the conventional wisdom of what can be done with public health and what can be done with these interventions, and sell not just like American public health authorities, meaning starting with the CDC, but also local public health people, but through the CDC, the entire world on the idea that social distancing works, that you can actually save a lot of lives. Now, you have to make judgments about like what are the economic costs of these measures and so on, and what's the value of a human life. You make those trade-off costs, those trade-off evaluations. But if you look at what's happened in the world, I mean, these guys' work led to some consensus in some places about what you should do. Now, clearly it was uneven, not only in this country. I mean, but clearly you can see the results. I mean, if you want to take a non-American political, something we don't have to get involved in American politics, look at what's happened in the Nordic countries. Denmark and Norway basically swallowed hook, line, and sinker these guys' argument about social distancing and its value. Sweden decided, no, we're going to let this virus run. Flash forward a year and a half later, Sweden has 5 times the death rate and actually with no economic benefit. And I think you can go country to country. The only one I've actually dug into a little bit is Australia. But you'll find there are people there when you ask them, like, how did you know where'd you get your plan? Where did this come from? How did you contain, unlike us, how did you contain the virus and save all these lives? They say, we just used this plan. The basis of it is this plan that the CDC told us about 15 years ago that these 2 guys wrote. And so it's a really good example of like what I was talking about before, of these people like starting with a curiosity or a question and like pursuing it to the ends of the earth. These two doctors, unknown to anybody outside the White House, go rethink this incredibly large event in human history, come up with a completely original take on it, base a plan and a policy on it, sell it to the world, and it saves, God knows how many lives. Now, it creates an awful lot of conflict too, but it saves a lot of lives.
That's great. As you think about your journey over the past 10 years or so, who would you say are the most notable groundbreakers that you've had the opportunity to interact with, and what made them groundbreaking to you?
I like the way you ignored whatever that distraction was. It was very distracting. So whatever. So I hope they're not throwing things at you there. That's what it's let me take two. Let me answer that with two. Let me give you two answers to that. Well, let's just stick. Let me just stick for one moment with the most recent book, just to establish like a connection. It's something there's been some rhyming in my own work. It's made me wonder about if there are patterns, not just to the groundbreakers, but to the way their relationship to the society. So one thing that I've been struck by, the book I've just written, the one it's most like is the book I wrote about the financial crisis, The Big Short. And it's most like that because the world I was describing was the most like this world in this way. Michael Lewis goes out trying to answer a question. The question in one case is, why does the U.S. response so awful when we had such resources? Why are so many Americans dying? The question in the other case is, how did all these big Wall Street firms that supposedly have like first call on all the talent and they know more than anybody about what's going on in the financial markets, et cetera, how did they get stuck holding hundreds of billions of dollars of bad subprime mortgage bets? Like, why was it that, how did the inside of the system fail there? In both cases, the people who I find who can answer the question are not inside the system. They're not deep in the system. They aren't inside Merrill Lynch or Citigroup, or they're not inside the Centers for Disease Control. They're fringy characters. Now, more or less fringy characters, but nevertheless, Carter Mesher, who has put his finger on exactly what's going on in China and exactly what it means to the United States by January 20th of last year, is doing it basically from his underpants in his bedroom in his spare time, and nobody's interested in hearing about it. That the wisdom is somehow not in the system. And similarly, the kind of people who are diagnosing what's going on in the American financial system in circa 2007, they aren't inside Citigroup and Merrill Lynch. Those aren't even, by 2008 or 9, those aren't the people who can best describe to me what's happened. It's these kind of fringy money managers, hedge fund guys, sort of, like, different characters, but who are kind of on the outside looking in, almost like the kid looking at the emperor with no clothes and seeing things that the people in the imperial palace, just for whatever reason, they can't see. So this is by way of saying there's a theme to all the characters I keep running up against, the situations I keep running into. And the theme is something like this, that to see the interesting truths, sometimes you have to be coming at it from an odd angle. And in these two big system failure sort of stories, that it was extremely hard to see the truth from the place where might think it was the easiest to see the truth, right inside of it. That and in some way, what happened inside the systems was people were incentivized not to see things that they needed to see. That's a big point about the last 10 years of my work, that I think I've seen that happen over and over and over. I would say the single most interesting sort of groundbreaking situation, it's more than 10 years. It's more than the last 10 years. It's the Moneyball story. And what's interesting about that, so the story is simply that you've got a poor baseball team. They're desperate. They know that if they kind of do with their money what everybody else does, they're down to lose. They're going to be chasing the same players, the same strategies. You do it with less money, you're going to lose. So you got to find some other way to come at the problem. Now, that sounds like a standard business story, but think about where they're doing it. This is what blew me away. They're doing it. They're trying to find better ways to value baseball players and to evaluate baseball strategies. Now think of it, it's a business, baseball. It's a business where the employees have been doing exactly the same job for like a century. And that they've been evaluated every day on the job since they've been doing the job. It's not like there's no data. There's statistics attached to everything they do. It's not like they're not people who think they know the answers to the questions already. Every American baseball fan thinks they know the answer to the question. And so what blew me away was the idea you could walk into something seemingly so understood and so seemingly so simple as professional baseball, and using better data and asking different questions of the data, you could come to a completely different understanding of what a good baseball player was or what a smart baseball strategy was. And to take it further, once you realize that like this could happen here, your mind starts to spin. And you realize that this is not like just a sports story. And where my mind started to spin and where I realized that like this might be to put it in your terms, the best groundbreaking story I've run across, was when I first when I started to like get to know the story. I was interviewing the players, and I had the misfortune of watching after a baseball game, all the Oakland A's coming out of the showers and they're all naked. And I thought those were the most unattractive professional athletes I've ever seen. They were like all misshapen. They were fat. They had fat ankles. They all looked wrong. One of them had 2 club feet, which was an amazing thing. I went to the front office and I said, if you lined your players up against the wall naked and asked any innocent outsider to ask what they did for a living, no one would guess they were professional baseball players, much less like a really successful professional baseball franchise. And what they said was, that's kind of part of the point here, that that what we've been able to do is see past appearances, and that what distracts the market is one of the things that distracts the market and causes distorted values of human beings is appearances. And if a guy looks like some other famous baseball player or looks kind of the way a baseball player should, he's likely to be overvalued or at least properly valued if he's any good. It's the ones that don't look right that end up surfacing for us because people don't see it. They look at them and they can't see the performance. They see the body. And if you think about this, stop thinking of it as sports. Stop thinking of it as baseball. If this can happen there, where can it happen? And the idea that you could walk into almost any arena with this frame of mind, with a respect for and an ability to deal with data, looking for better measurements of what people do, and completely overturn how the people in that environment are valued, and find completely the same inefficiencies that exist on a baseball field, in a law firm, in a warehouse, in a school. You just knew that this was true in any environment. So that the reason that story was so sort of had such an effect on me is I thought it goes everywhere. There's nowhere it doesn't go, and it all starts with someone with a problem asking a question like, how do we find cheap baseball players? And it's a really simple question with a really complicated answer that you only get to if you are completely obsessed with finding the answer and completely willing to be mocked by everybody around you. But it's so I think that's sort of to me the coolest, groundbreaking story I ever kind of ran across.
I like it. So you had a quick question from the audience. I'm not sure what your opinion is, but the Astros or the Braves, who's going to win the World Series?
You know, I don't want to offend anybody in the audience with my answer, but everybody in the audience must know the feeling of so many of the teams you sort of cared for got knocked out early, and you're left with two things you could care less about. And if you watch long enough, right? If you makes a point of watching, you quickly form an allegiance. Like you start to think you will eventually find someone to root for. But I have a real problem with the Astros. I'm not over the cheating scandal. I'm not over the cheating scandal. I'm not ready to just let that be bygones be bygones. I feel like there was a deep rot there. It just wasn't a handful of people who kind of went off and did something bad. I think that the organization took a very cynical view of the game. So now the Braves, they have their own problems. So so the honest answer is I don't care. But if you put a gun to my head, I'd take the Braves. And the bigger truth is that here's a case of like intuition being a bad guide. Whenever you're in a baseball series, even a 7-game series, there is so much randomness. There's so much luck in a baseball game. You don't want to believe that, but it's true. Where the ball lands when it leaves the bat, there's a lot of luck. The individual performances from game to game, there's a lot of randomness. There's a lot of noise. These are essentially unpredictable things, much less predictable than a lot of other sporting events. And in fact, the luck ends up deceiving people in the way they evaluate the game. They think they've seen a pattern that doesn't exist. And this is why, like Billy Beane, the hero of Moneyball, says my shit doesn't work in the playoffs, because in very small samples, in a process with a lot of randomness, it's very hard to predict. So the predicting of it, I'll leave to others. If I had to pick a team, I'd pick the Braves. And sorry I went on so long about that.
No, that was great. That was probably more insight than the audience ever thought that they might get. So it's awesome. So it's actually interesting. You talk a lot about intuition and maybe even trained intuition. So can you share your insights with this group and the numerous people that are dialed in online? How do you go about developing that muscle?
It's a really good question, because when you think, what is intuition? I mean, another way to put it is you don't know why you know something. You think you know something and you don't know why. That's not a bad definition of it, right? Now, and as I said before, there's a real problem is people think they know all kinds of things they don't actually know, or that worse, that actually they're unknowable, right? It's unknowable whether the coin is going to land on heads or tails. It's unknowable what the stock price of IBM is going to do tomorrow, or a year from now. It's unknowable who's going to be the next president of the United States. These are essentially unknowable things. And people who get on television and say they know, the first thing you do is turn them off. I think it's like a really useful rule is identifying people who are really happy to make predictions about things that are unpredictable. I mean, corporate conferences are like built on these people, and you got to be incredibly careful about, and you get a lot of useful negative information about people who predict the future, and so you got to be really careful about that. But so what's the positive answer? And let me talk about my own experience. Like I'm totally a creature of intuition, and that I don't have an algorithm to find a story. There's nothing scientific or intellectually respectable about how I go about figuring out what will be a good story, or whether this character is worth following, or whether this book is something anybody's going to want to read, right? But I seem to be able to do it. I mean, they all seem to more or less work out. And and I mean, I don't want to go too far with this. I'm sure that there are going to be clunkers here and there, and not everybody will like all my books. But just generally, that I think I've actually built a muscle. And I think it's just repetition. And it's a muscle that did not really exist in the beginning of my career, like really didn't exist. And I'll give you an example of like the beginning of my career when I was first trying to get things published. The first thing I tried to get published that I thought everybody would be fascinated by was I was volunteering. I was just out of college, and I was volunteering as a soup ladler at the Bowery Mission and Young Men's Home, a homeless shelter. And I took an interest in the different kinds of people who were homeless on the street. Now, that's not necessarily a bad subject, right? It could be, in some hands, it could be a good subject. But I wrote it up, and I tried to send it out to people who would publish it. And I decided that the place that would be most interested in my work was in-flight magazines. I don't know why. I don't know why I thought that. So I sent to Delta Airlines and American Airlines, and I got these letters back that said, it's really curious that you think we would want this because right? We're trying to. So I mean, I didn't have any sense of like really what people were going to be interested in or how to interact with them. But I've done it now for so long. There's like a muscle memory. You do start to. So repetition is one. When you go, I tell you an academically respectable story. One of the characters of one of my books, The Undoing Project, is the psychologist Danny Kahneman. Danny Kahneman is most famous both winning the Nobel Prize in economics, though he knows no economics, but he turned economics on its head with his work in psychology, and a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And Danny Kahneman is an incredible skeptic of intuition. Most of his career is devoted to showing how expert intuition is flawed. Like you're better off with a simple algorithm than like even a doctor's expert judgment. His whole career is dedicated to this. But he did something really interesting. He acknowledged that there was a passionate hostility to his work. There's a school of thinking basically hostile to the whole Kahneman-Tversky oeuvre. I think it's called natural decision making. And the idea is that a lot of people who do things great, who experts, do things very well, not knowing why they did them. And they can, and there's a place for intuition. The leader of the school is a guy, very interesting intellectual, named Gary Klein. Kahneman and Klein got together to see where they could find agreement. And like, where does okay, maybe you're right, maybe intuition works. Where does it work? They quickly agreed that like, if it doesn't work in the stock market, there are places that didn't work, but they had really interesting examples where they agreed. And one of them was firefighting. And they noticed that like people who led firefighting crews, who were well-known, successful firefighters, were capable of extraordinary judgments under intense pressure, like life or death moments, where they could not explain until really thought about it later, why they made a call. And I think one of the examples where they interviewed a firefighter, and moments before the house collapses, he screams at his whole crew, "Get out of the house." And when he gets out, he doesn't know exactly why he thought that. Now, later he realized that they thought they were fighting a fire that was above them. They were, but his feet were hot. And he realized that he didn't think about it. He didn't process it in a conscious level. But his feet were hot because there was actually a fire beneath it. And the fire was in the basement. And the floor was about to collapse. And he picked up on that like that. So how do you pick up on that? You pick up on that by being in the situations over and over and over and over again. How do you pick up on like how to tell a story that people are going to want to read? I mean, I think it's the intuition is what story is going to be interesting to people. And I think you just do I can't think of a substitute other than, well, repetition, but repetition with feedback. So that if you don't get feedback, you're never going to build intuition. You're never going to know what worked and what didn't work. So having feedback would be the other part of the equation.
May I ask who has given you the best feedback in your career?
Oh, there are two. I think when I think of the feedback I get, um, I feel like there's buckets of feedback. The most valuable person in my book writing career, I've had the same book editor since I was 26, 7 years old, Star Lawrence at W.W. Norton. Um, and I can now tell if we're in the same room by the expression on his face, if he's on the phone, I could tell within 15 seconds, not only whether the chapter I just sent him worked, but why it worked or didn't work, just from his tone of voice now. But that's a relationship that's been honed over a long time. His judgment about whether what I'm doing makes any sense that's been just like irreplaceable. So that there's that kind of feedback. There's another kind of feedback altogether that I value immensely, and it's the feedback of readers I don't know, and when a book because and the feedback that what's interesting to me is this: um, a writer writes a book. Um, the writer usually thinks he knows what the book is about. In fact, the writer in his own mind is the storyteller is kind of sure of how the reader or the listener, whoever it is going to not only respond but decipher, interpret the story that he's written. But if you write a story that's at all interesting and that can be it can be interpreted in different ways. And it is shocking to me every time I write a book how people see the book, the range of responses, the different, and I don't know what they are until I've heard them. I'll give you the first, and I realized this when I published my first book was Liar's Poker, and it was the story of me on Wall Street. And if you'd asked me what I was going to achieve with this book, apart from entertaining, my friends, which is basically what I had in mind. But if you said, what moral purpose, like what higher purpose does the author have here? It was pretty simple. I was really irritated when Wall Street started to boom back then, and what Wall Street could pay a recent college graduate became so much greater than every place else that all this talent was being siphoned off into finance, which is fine up to a point, but only up to a point. It seemed like a huge waste. And where it really bothered me was where I saw classmates of mine in college who had actual kind of callings, like they loved something and they were going to go do this something. But then Goldman Sachs dangles, a big stack of cash, and their whole lives go off on this. And so I thought, if you asked me what this book was going to do, it was going to be for those kids to read, and they'd say, this is all kind of silly. I know what it is now. It's demystified for me. I'm not going to waste my time going to do that. I'm going to go be an oceanographer. I'm going to do whatever it is I was put on earth to do. So that's what I think I've written. I swear to you, within a month, I had 1,000 letters from young college students saying, "Dear Mr. Lewis, I've read your book about how to get ahead on Wall Street, and now I'm even more interested than I've ever been in a career on Wall Street. What tips did you leave out?" So this happens, but this happens over and over and over, and that feedback is really valuable, and the nuance. And it's valuable because I came to realize that allowing the reader or the listener to interpret it however they want to interpret it that's the key to a successful interaction. They have to be able to make the thing their own. So what I learned from that is kind of how to build in holes to the work where people can come in and sort of maybe even misinterpret it, but come in and have their own thing. Leave enough space in the story that the reader can insert themselves and have some discretion over what this all means. And I've learned how to do that from the feedback. It's really helped.
That's good stuff. As you think about all of the subject matter that you write about and probably think about every day, what gives you the most hope for the future?
It's a good time to ask that question, right? Um, you know, I can give you a couple of answers that pop to mind. Um, the progress that science is capable of, it's unbelievable. I mean, the one form this takes is my guys in the White House who dream up a strategy for dealing with a pandemic before you have a vaccine that probably has saved millions of lives. I mean, that may be an exaggeration, but maybe not. An incredible. I mean, and that is it was a work of science. But the vaccines are. I mean, these vaccines are miracles. I mean, you look at this. They're the byproduct or the product of a conscious government effort that starts with this pandemic plan, 15 years ago, to fund this sort of research into a different kind of vaccine production that yields just in time, more or less, a vaccine that's more successful than any vaccine's ever been. It's incredible, right? You look at that and you think, science can save us. Like knowledge creation can save us. We're creating knowledge at a breathtaking pace. At the same time, this society that is so great at creating knowledge has an unbelievable talent for not using it. An unbelievable talent for we do know that, but we're going to pretend we don't. It's so there's an asterisk next to this. Science can tell you what's going to happen to the planet in 50 years, and science may even be able to solve the problem. But you have to care enough about it, believe it, and care enough about it. I would say the other thing, and this is just a weird byproduct of what I've been writing about the last few years. I wrote a book before the Premonition called The Fifth Risk, and it was a quirky view of the federal government. It looked at the federal government as a manager of a portfolio of risks, many of them existential risks, like climate change, but food security, and just like this, energy security, and this is like one thing after another that essentially, if the government doesn't do it, nobody's going to do it. And they're public goods, this management of the risk. And I felt I was wandering into an infrastructure that had been allowed to degrade and that had been kind of under assault for almost a couple of generations now. That there was the relationship between the American people and the federal government is a bizarre relationship. It's a democracy in which many of the people regard their government as a hostile invader, and no other society on earth has this same problem. And in spite of this, in spite of the bad period we've gone through in the relationship of the people to the government, it was incredible. The caliber of the person who is still willing to devote their careers to managing the risk, that just first-rate minds and first-rate characters who made wonderful literary characters. And the fact that people are willing to do that in spite of those obstacles gives me a lot of hope. Like, what happens if you actually put the wind at their backs instead of in their faces? Like, we can solve a lot of problems.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy book tour schedule, and we wish you all the best of luck with that. And maybe we'll get the opportunity to have you swing by the office one of the days when you're in San Francisco.
I would love it. I live there, so we'll do that. All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.